Ben Wallerstein. I'm the founder of Whiteboard Advisors. I'm thrilled to have the chance to interview my friend Jake Schwartz.
Hi, Ben.
How are you?
I'm pretty good.
You look extraordinarily relaxed, maybe the most relaxed I've ever seen you.
This San Diego, that the air is just totally different here, and it's really, well, if for people who have ever gone through the process of any kind of big deal is sort of all-consuming for a long time, and it's such a thrill to get to finally sort of go public with it and talk about it, because I've been thinking about it for a really long time, and so it's great to finally get to sort of be out in the open with it and to share how awesome our future is going to be.
So 5 years ago, give or take, you told me that you thought the strategic buyer for General Assembly might be a staffing company, and I'm not sure. I don't think you had probably even met the people at Adecco at that point, but you said, "Gosh, I think it could be a group like Adecco." What was going through your mind then? What's the path to getting to this?
That's true, and I do think I said Adecco, but it was really.
And you hadn't met them then?
No, not yet. It was very early on. The first phase of GA was all about like being an education company, right? Because we were this tech thing, and people thought of us as co-working actually early on, and so we did things like come to the GSV conference. In fact, this is my 7th year at the GSV conference, and but very soon I realized that like the word education comes with all of this very specific baggage, right? It has a certain frame of reference that involves students and tuition and an experience in time, and then it's over. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that everything what we were about was about return on investment. It was all about connecting the pipes together way more than it was ever about people spending time in a classroom. And that was sort of always, we talked about the outcome is what matters. That's what people are investing in. They're not investing to sit in a room. That's not the product. And we still say that today. And I think once you sort of look through that lens, you realize that what we were really doing was sort of a marketplace, or a two-sided marketplace between individuals and employers. And we got really good at the individuals, but the employers are the much harder, but also in some ways more important side of the market, and you have to have both in order for it to work and succeed. And so we embarked on a journey starting then, many, many years ago, to build relationships with employers. And I mean, the reality is, I don't think what I appreciated at the time is how much more difficult it is to build relationships and meaningful relationships with employers versus it is to put up a website and tell the world you're doing something and get people to email you and say they're interested. And so it's been a long process for us of deepening those relationships with our employers. For the last 2 years, our sort of key pillar in the company was radically deepen our relationships with employers. And so when you look at where does GA fit in the ecosystem, it's really about where do we find even greater ways to increase those relationships, deepen those relationships, become a key part of the talent value chain, right? And sort of reinsert learning and sort of transformational skill development as a potential way to disrupt parts of that talent value chain, right? So that was the theory. I have some pretty crazy looking decks that I would like show my team from years ago that now kind of look like I was super prescient, but I don't think that. I think it was more that it just kind of made sense. When you're on the inside of it, it made sense for who we were and what we were all about.
And does this force a certain like renormalization of the education ecosystem? So I think about like when LinkedIn bought lynda.com, and I thought, gosh, that's brilliant. I'd never really thought about that before, but it's like peanut butter and chocolate makes all the sense in the world, right? So I don't think that companies like Adecco haven't been on the tip of the tongue for people at a conference like this historically, right? Like, what does that mean in terms? What does the future look like?
Well, I think it's very interesting. I mean, if you reflect on the fact that that first time I went to ASU GSV, when it was actually in Arizona, right?
We were sitting on the patio.
We were sitting
at Sky Song.
Sky Song, right? It wasn't even big enough to like need a hotel, right? It was just at that little.
Not going to sessions.
Right. And
Sorry.
and I remember that year, and it was like the dialogue. Everybody asked me, "So when are you going to get accredited? What's your plan to get accredited?" Everybody knows that that's the only way to create a real business in higher education, and I was sort of like, I was the one being like, why? I don't get it. I don't see why do we need to do that? And people thought we were kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And to think now, fast forward 7 years in the future, right, where the title of this conference, or at least like the sort of subheading, is like talent, right? And
I think it's actually San Diego. Is the
subheading. Oh yeah, okay. That is sort of the subheading of this conference. So that's the subtext of everything that's happening here. But you think about fast forward to that, and the fact that there's probably 20 offshoots of the GA model running around the conference, and the fact is that almost everybody here has to answer the question, what is your career strategy? What is your employment strategy? That's a pretty fundamental shift that I'd like to believe we maybe had a small part in making that move. And I think it's a very powerful and very important move, and I think it's only going to continue for very long in the future. And for me, I chose Adecco as our partner because they have the largest platform on the planet that actually is in the business of hiring, deploying people, and every part of the service ecosystem that involves.
Can you talk through that scale a little bit? I mean, I don't know if you have those talking points on the tip of your tongue yet, but talk about the scale of their enterprise globally.
I mean, they have over 100,000 enterprise clients. They're in, I don't know how many, Eleanor is in this room. How many countries are you guys in? 70 countries. $11 billion in revenue. 1.1 million people to work. I mean, that is a scale that allows you to start to think differently about what the future of work actually it is. And that has become a buzzword about the future of work. But like, it's amazing how people who talk about the future of work are really not spending time at work within that ecosystem, right? And it involves more than just a couple sexy tech kind of ecosystems. It involves people who go to work every day in a small local healthcare office, or people who work in the back office in a Midwestern town, or people who are outsourced in India who are doing like key infrastructure work for massive multinationals. This is all part of the future of work, and what that looks like, that is the sort of giant thing beneath the tip of the iceberg that has to change, and it's where all the action really is. And I think we're sort of finally getting to that point. I'm very excited to be able to be part of sort of the journey of innovating around what that could look like.
Yeah, and so 20 campuses, 50,000 plus students through your programs, and you're talking about putting 1.1 million people to work per day. So the juxtaposition in terms of scale, I think, is really profound. It should, sort of expands our horizons and thinking.
Completely, and I mean, that was what was so fun. I mean, on Monday, obviously, we did a ton of communication internally to our team.
What was the response like?
It was after doing for so long, you don't know. I mean, what the response is going to be, and I think we had a few messages for them. First is that we, GA is keeping the brand, we're keeping the team. Basically the only real difference that will happen is that I now don't have a board to answer to. I have a boss.
Imagine being Jake's boss.
His name is Sergio, and he's Italian, and he seems like a pretty nice guy so far.
Got it. So far, so good. You're so manageable.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's gonna be no transition problems there.
No.
But like other than that, like when we start, I mean, this is how Adecco runs.
Yeah.
They're a holding company. I mean, it was sort of in a lot of ways when Pearson was at its peak, like how the best part about what Pearson was doing. And I think in some ways when you're around a giant corporation, you really have to organize around a theme, a way of operating and doing business. But you can, I think, err by trying to integrate too tightly. And Adecco just believes that at its core. And so their goal is not to integrate us in. I'm sure there's going to be some stuff about back office processing and things like that. But really it's about, okay, keep doing what you're doing, and now let's think about how we can leverage all of these amazing other businesses that are definitely related in theme and content and customer to what you're already doing.
So you didn't chase accreditation. You sort of notably opted not to participate in the EQUIP program. You've been publicly averse to public funding of your programs. You've talked a lot about historically, establishing barriers to entry in other ways that were either non-regulatory or otherwise. Just to talk a little bit about your learnings when you think back to the start of this event, 7 or so years ago, to where we are today. Talk a little bit about how that sort of vision has evolved, and also maybe just learnings that you can share with other entrepreneurs or investors in the room.
Yeah. I'd love to. I mean, look, the accreditation thing, to me, it was like, it was pretty obvious that when I came into this industry as sort of an outsider, and I was kind of naive, and I was wandering around, I was like sort of thinking about things from first principles. I was like, okay, if you look at what's the problem in education, is that they talk about return on investment. I mean, in higher education, I'm going to be very specific here about this, and even specific parts of higher education, they talk about a return on investment, but nobody, it seems, is actually accountable to the numbers around what the investment is or what the return is. And I mean, at some level, that was the insight, right? Like at some level, that was the thing. But it was also that if you look around, what you've seen is just, you saw for decades, every year, 3 to 5% price increases. Mm-hmm. You saw sort of, whether it was a for-profit or nonprofit, I don't think it really mattered. It was all about just this weird surplus and pricing power based on what? It's the same thing that happens in healthcare, which is you have this third-party payer who was sort of standing at the ready to pay whatever it needed, and it was long-term debt that society was telling every individual was a no-brainer to do. And you had this sort of, it was like a weirdly complicit system that was working, but was very much fraying at the edges. And so I said, well, one of the problems with third-party payer is it creates all sorts of perverse market dynamics. And I think one of the biggest is it creates competition among the players around non-economic things, right?
Yeah.
And I said, and if you're really thinking about how I'm going to be accountable, and the other thing I thought about a lot is like, I mean, look, University of Phoenix, when it started, had an amazing mission. Yeah. They were serving a serious need of how do we get more adult learners access to degrees, right? And which is a real problem at the time, and people forget this.
Yeah.
And you sort of think of how they get referred to now, and it's sort of a tragedy. And so I spent a lot of time early on just thinking, how do we avoid that?
Yeah.
How do we talked about that a lot.
Sure.
Like, how do we not? And I think one of the key things was literally saying, make sure that the system is such that you are always accountable to your customer. Yeah. And never let it get too far away from that.
It might have been Goldie, actually, that directed us to coverage from early on, like in the archives of the Chronicle.
We talked about it. We were like, wow, like, because you don't even realize that, and so you can say like, wow, sometimes these stories start one way and end another, and it's a really important thing to remember. So I think that's sort of number one, right? And so you have to think about economic incentives at a pretty deep level, I think, especially in this space. Number two, and this is a business point, but I think probably the macro point here I would say is that business models and business strategy and unit economics and payer dynamics, all of these, money sometimes in these forums become a little uncouth. We don't like to talk about it, we don't stress it, right? We don't like really dwell on it, at least not in public. And I do think that in some ways it is at the heart of all the problems and all of the solutions is who pays what, when, where, why, and how. It's sort of the line I've been using forever. And getting that stuff aligned, right? Getting it so you have a sustainable business model that doesn't make you do irrational things. Getting it so that your mission and your business model are not in too much conflict, let's call it that just to be reasonable. Making sure that like you will be around long enough to see your vision manifest. These are all incredibly important things that I think sometimes it gets commented on a lot less than, oh, like, I'm gonna troll these guys because, I'm from this camp and that seems like it's bullshit, and I mean, it's all sorts of crazy, and I think like, I do think business, I think barriers to entry, moats, it's like a classic Warren Buffett thing. I think if you think about what happened in the boot, for years I would come on stage and my agenda at ASU was to be like, please slow your roll, there is no such thing as a boot camp industry, right? Because it was so new and and there were all these people popping up all over the place because there was no barrier to entry. You can pop a shingle up so easily. And it was, we had sort of a many-year phased approach of what we were trying to do, and we saw all these people sweep in, and we had to sort of fend off what our positioning was, how we were going to maintain that as a sustainable thing, how we were going to avoid getting pulled into the sort of downward spiral that those kind of dynamics can pull. And I think one of the other things that happens a lot of time in education is nobody spends time thinking about competitive strategy. Because the idea is, well, if we're all competing for the kids, then it's all right, right? But competition has negative impacts, not just on a business's bottom line. It has impacts on the amount of investment they make. It has impacts on the amount they sort of put towards intangible benefits. It has impacts on the risks and the experiments they can make to innovate more. And so, I think there's a lot of VC activity in this space that's investing in the fifth largest player in a crowded space that's unit economics are somewhat unclear. And to me, there's something great about that in that it's sort of there's a sort of pseudo-philanthropic element to education that's cool. But it also creates a lot of waste in the system. And it also creates a dynamic where we're not necessarily building the next generation of companies that can really have the weight to change the way we operate. And I think that's just something to reflect on and think about.
So talk a little bit too about maybe two things. One, sort of inflection points along the way. So this
Absolutely.
You talked a little bit about sort of like radically deepening relationships with employers. But take us like way back, like when you were General Assembly space, right? Who were your peers like early on back in the day, and what were some of the notable
we were in like
points?
a death match with Skillshare, right? Skillshare was like our number one enemy. Do you remember, Steve? You remember that, right? And
I remember going to visit you you were like in the co-working space. I love that place. That was cool.
So, but I'll tell you, I mean, it really started with this thing that we had this room, and we called it a classroom, because it was kind of cheeky and it was on brand for what we had sort of designed the space to be. And then we said, let's just try putting some classes in there. And the response was just awesome, right? And we were selling out this little room, and I'd actually been in arts. I had been an arts entrepreneur previously, and I said, wow, this is really exciting, but we're selling 30 seats for a different class every night of the week. This is like the worst off-Broadway theater on the planet. So I was like, what can we do? And that was where this insight came from. Okay, education is a thing. There's clearly some kind of resonance from an emotional level to the idea of what we were offering. But how do we make it something that's sustainable? And that's when I started thinking about my own experiences coming out of college and feeling so lost and lonely in the world of work and scrambling for an on-ramp, and then going to business school and sort of feeling like there was a lot of fluff around the sort of core, and what did that mean, and how could we maybe innovate around that? And it was then applying that concept, those emotional concepts, those memories, those ideas, on top of the fact that we just had some energy around this thing. And I mean,
you could have packaged it up and just like gone online in a really aggressive way at that point in time.
We could have, and you know what? Our first pitch to Series A was that we were going to be the cool lynda.com, and if you look at the multiples, maybe we should have done it. But at the same time, for us, our true north was all about return on investment. And I've always said, and we do a lot of online now, but it always starts with what results can we expect from this, and can we deliver them reliably? And we have programs where we can deliver reliably. We've proven it. We know it. That's great. But we've seen way too much starting with, how do I have a business with zero marginal costs? How do I scale it? How do I make it seem scalable so VCs will invest in it? And then I'll worry about the fact that it's really expensive to get customers and I can't deliver anything, later down the road. And we're seeing some really big companies with that set of challenges right now. And we just decided to start with the value proposition first and worry about modality second.
Worst off-Broadway theater. Great exit. Congratulations. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy with a more amazing team, and I think along the way continue to do some really profound things in terms of the social impact work that you're doing, which I think many of us admire.
And we will continue to do so very, very much with more resources behind us. So.
Cool. All right. Well, Jake will be performing here all for the next 24 hours. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Jake.